As you have already known, I was born in Germany. We left Germany in 1938, 2 weeks before the Kristallnacht, when all Jews were arrested, for Holland. And we left Holland in 1940, 1 month before the invasion of Holland. And then, and I want to add, we went from Holland to Palestine on the ship, the Patria, which was sunk on the next journey after that, with 250 people killed. So we were always sort of one step ahead. And in Holland, I went to the Gymnasium in Amsterdam, and my best friend there, who is not Jewish, and he saw me afterwards as one of the prosecutors in the Eichmann trial 20 years later. And then he called me and I invited him to Israel, and then he told me that after the war he made some research and he found out that of all the about hundreds of Jewish pupils in our school, that I think practically I'm one of the very few of the Jewish pupils who remained alive. And what really shook me even more, I later read in history books that between the outbreak of war in 1939 and March and 1940, when the Germans entered Holland, Hitler had fixed 7 times a date for the invasion of Holland. And every time he postponed it at the last minute. Once the astrologers had told him that the star situation wasn't favorable. Once they heard something on the BBC, and they thought the British were suspecting something. A number of times, weather conditions were bad. I mean, 7 times when we were still there were dates for the invasion, and it was postponed by Hitler at the last minute. And then the 8th time, when they did enter, we just left Holland. So sort of everyone thought that my father had a sort of sixth sense as to when to detach himself. Then when the German army under General Rommel approached Palestine during the war through Libya and Egypt, everyone came to my father and they said, "Where now? Where do we go now?" So my father said, "Here is the last stop. Here we won't budge." So then Rommel had to go back. So now you see the real, don't take me too seriously, but everyone said that there must be some kind of reason to that. 2 days after Eichmann came to Palestine, to Israel, I was then the deputy state attorney of Israel, and the Minister of Justice called me and asked me whether I would be prepared to be the legal advisor of the police bureau that was entrusted with investigating that case. So for 9 months, they vacated the whole prison for that. And Eichmann was kept there, and all the 30, 40 police officers, and I had my office there. So for 9 months, I was actually living in that same prison with Eichmann. And I'll talk about that later. Then afterwards, I appeared as one of the prosecutors, where there were 3 of us. Mr. Hausner, the Attorney General, and I was number 2, and the District Attorney of Tel Aviv, number 3. We examined all the witnesses in court and argued the case in court, and then also we appeared on appeal. Now, I mean, when I was state attorney and when I was a judge, I mean, I never had routine cases. It was always a sort of special, adventurous stories. But anyway, we can't touch all those, maybe some other time. So today I've been asked to concentrate on the Eichmann trial. There too, one can talk about many hours, but I mean, there are so many problems: the legal problems, the human problems, the historical problems, the ethical problems. But I'm sure that many of you are aware of many of these problems. What I would like to touch today before you are sort of special things, special facts and special impressions and special important issues that are somehow in my memory in connection with that trial more than any other trial. Also, what is interesting, maybe you may also know about it, but to me still comes a little bit as a surprise that of all that 50 years have passed, And the interest in the Eichmann trial seems to grow from year to year all over the world. I mean, there are other cases where also the killing and the Holocaust has been mentioned, but only in the marginal sense, like in the Nuremberg trials and other cases. And the only case where the Holocaust and the genocide killing was really mentioned from every aspect was really in the Eichmann case. So I want to, let's say, start right away after the minister asked me, so 2 days after Eichmann was there, and so when I came to this prison, until his lawyers came, I was his only contact also with the outside world. But I let him know that if he had some technical problems or some formal problems, then he could come to me and he could discuss it and talk about this with me, but that I was not prepared to talk to him about the offenses for which were alleged against him, because then I would have to be a witness, and I knew I would be one of the prosecutors in the trial. So at first, I did not see him myself. I was just sitting in my office. So I'm very often asked, what was your first meeting with him? Well, that's also a moment I cannot forget. I was sitting in my office there, and I was reading the autobiography of Rudolf Höss, not Hess, the assistant of Hitler, but Höss, the commander of Auschwitz. He was hanged in Poland in 1948, 12 years before Eichmann was caught. But before he was executed, he wrote his autobiography. So on that day, I was reading how he described how they had many days where they had to kill 1,000 Jewish children a day. And he described how the children sometimes used to kneel down and ask to be spared. And he wrote, when I had to push the children together with my colleagues, when we had to push the children into the gas chambers, my knees were getting a bit wobbly. But then he added, but I always felt afterwards ashamed of this weakness of mine after I talked to Obersturmbannführer, that was his rank, Adolf Eichmann of the SS, because Eichmann explained to me that it's especially the children that have to be killed first. He says, because where is the logic that you kill a generation of older people and you leave alive the generation of possible avengers who can afterwards create that race again? Well, maybe there's some kind of logic in that, but anyway, 10 minutes after I read that, a police officer came in and said, Mr. Bach, Adolf Eichmann wants to see you. So when I heard his steps outside and he was sitting opposite me a yard away after I just read that, it was a bit difficult to keep a poker face at that particular moment. One other thing, you know, sometimes people think, you know, when you read about the murder of millions, and here 300,000, and here 700,000. I mean, of course that's frightening. That is where the main evidence, you know, about what we could show, where people were killed and how many and so on. But you know, when I think of memory or moments that I cannot forget, it is a little bit different. It is when there were some attempts to save sometimes a particular person, one particular Jewish person or a family, and a request was made to Eichmann, and Eichmann had to give his decision. And I had a police officer for every country and for every topic. And everyone, my instructions were, whenever they went through millions of documents, the German government was very cooperative, and they they cooperated very much, and they sent us all the files of the SS and the army and the military and all the ministries and so on. My instructions were, whenever there's something which might be relevant to the trial, they have to bring it to me, and I would decide what will come in and not. So when there was an attempt to save someone, some Jewish person, that I got this first, but all these were in chronological order. So it took a few days until I got the reply of Eichmann given to me for perusal. And I had dreams at night that sometimes one person, or one particular person with a special case, they could be saved, but without any exception. The moment the decision came to Eichmann, the decision was always fatal. I don't want to speak so theoretical, just give you one or two examples. One day, the person responsible for France, the police officer, he brought me a telegram sent by a general of the German army to Eichmann. It was the commander of Paris who wrote to Eichmann that there was a Professor Weiss, an expert, a Jewish expert on radar, and who had made many inventions and patents in connection with radar. And it was very important for the German army to examine this man in connection and comparison with what the German scientists had found about radar. And therefore, he insists that this man and his wife should not be deported to the East. Now, I must admit, here in the middle of the war, a member of the Wehrmacht, of the German army, he demands that. Here, I thought clearly he must agree. After a few days, the answer of Eichmann, on a point of view of principle, I cannot possibly agree, and I reject your petition. A few days later, a note. The German general had called by telephone and had said, "How dare you countermand my orders? I am a general of the Wehrmacht." And the answer of Eichmann, "And I am an Obersturmbannführer of the SS, and I don't care what rank you have in the army." A few days later, Eichmann writes to that officer, to that general, "I have examined the matter further, and I found out that the German army has already taken over all the patents of that Jew Weiss. Therefore, I see no reason even for one more day to postpone the deportation of that Jew Weiss." And then a note that this man had, in fact, he and his wife had been arrested and sent to death to Auschwitz. Just want to add in that connection, when I appeared afterwards as prosecutor, because the expert, whenever there was something that directly connected with Eichmann, I usually questioned all these witnesses in court. So France was one of the, all Western Europe and Hungary and so on, I dealt with those in court, and so I put in these documents about Professor Weiss. 2 days later, my secretary came to me and they said, "Well, there is a young lady outside, wants to see you." "Who is that?" "What's her name?" "Alisa Weiss." Don't know her. Anyway, she came in and said, "I am the daughter of that Professor Weiss. I was a baby when they took my parents away. My parents saw that, apparently, that they were coming to fetch them. They sent me to neighbors. The neighbors kept me and sent me to America. And there I read, I'm living now, and I read what you put in these documents about my parents. Not only didn't I know my parents, I don't even have a picture of what they looked like. Could you give me some advice how I can at least get a picture of that?" Just to mention it as one of the things difficult to forget. A few days after that French affair, a Dutch, the person responsible for Holland, he came to me and he showed me a letter written by the fascist leader, the leader of the fascist party in Holland, who wrote to Eichmann that there were some Jews, I think 10 or 12, who were people like that. They were members of the fascist party of Holland. And he insists that these people should not be deported because it would be demoralizing for the fascist party of Holland, because these were loyal members of the party. In order to make it more attractive for Eichmann, he wrote, "These Jewish members might even do intelligence work inside the Jewish community, and they might help you to find all the Jews that you want to find and where they are and so on." So again, I thought, under those conditions, he will not deport them. The answer of Eichmann, a question of principle, I cannot possibly agree. Then he wrote, "If you say it will be demoralizing to your party members if they are sent away this week, all right, let's wait 2 or 3 weeks. By then, people will have got used So the deportation of the Jews to such an extent that it won't make any more impression. I mean, just one more case which was so typical. One day, a telegram was given to me from the Italian consul in Lithuania. He wrote to Eichmann that there's a woman, Mrs. Kotzi, she is Jewish, she's an Italian, but her parents live in Lithuania. And she visited her parents in Lithuania, and she was caught there by the German army or SS, and they were discussing whether to send her to the death camps. So this Italian consul wrote, "This woman is the widow of a high officer in the Italian army who fell fighting, and he was most efficient and most courageous. All Italy is speaking about him. He was one of the most remarkable persons in the Italian army, and therefore we in the Italian authorities insist that this woman, this widow, should be given the chance to return to Italy." Now, again, I must say, Italy, the ally of Germany, after all, in this fight. And this woman, the widow of a high officer who fought together with the German army. So anyway, the answer of Eichmann, out of the question, and they saw to it that this woman was sent to her death. I mean, just multiply that 100 of times, then you can understand, I mean, this sort of traumatic effect that many during the investigation somehow struck me even more than to read about thousands or tens of thousands, because it really gave you all this frightening picture. Just one more moment that I want to tell you about. As I told you, we had information from all over the world, millions of documents. But I was particularly interested to get information from Poland, where the death camps were. But the Polish government was very anti-Israeli at the time, and they gave instructions that no Polish citizen was permitted to help us, to cooperate with us and give us material. But there were many, of course, therefore we didn't get official assistance. But there were quite a number of Polish people who wanted to help us. But in order to protect themselves, they sent us documents with information and with evidence, but without disclosing their names, anonymously. Now, one day, I'll never forget, I received a letter with typewritten pages where there was the number of Jews in 42 and 43 who every day came to Auschwitz, and the numbers that were given to them on their arms. And we, of course, hundreds, thousands, and more than millions. And that, of course, was particularly important. But in order to protect himself, the man had typed this in typewritten pages without a stamp, without a signature, without showing where that came from. Now, I don't have to explain to you that you can't, in a criminal case, certainly not a criminal case like that, you cannot use such documents without showing where it came from. But this was so important. So I asked all the police officers to assemble, and I showed them these documents, and I said, "Tell me, has any of you any idea whether it might be admissible evidence?" There was quiet. No one spoke, but I had an idea. I said, "Look, maybe we do the opposite what we usually do. Someone who prepares a letter, or there was a stamp, or you saw where it came from. But maybe we just try to prove that these documents in fact are true. There are hundreds of Israelis now living in Israel who were in Auschwitz. They still have the number. They remember when they got to Auschwitz. Now, if you say, for instance, that any Israeli who was sent to Auschwitz in July 42, that he should come to the police and ask him when he arrived there, and ask him what number he had, and then compare it to these documents, and then try to show that, in fact, these documents are true documents that are in confirmation of the facts. I had not yet finished saying that, And the officer responsible for Poland pulled up the sleeve of his shirt, and he showed us a number, and he said, I arrived in Auschwitz in November 43, and that is my number, and that's exactly fitting with that. Now, I had no idea that this man came from Poland. I certainly had no idea that he was in Auschwitz. But I had the impression that he hadn't told his friends and the police either. Now, policemen are not known as weak kind of people, but when he pulled up that sleeve, 3 or 4 minutes was absolute silence. You know, not one police officer uttered a sound. When you ask you about minutes, I mean, there are more important things like that, but still, that's also a moment that are impossible to forget. Another thing, during the trial itself, afterwards, Eichmann was asked what he thought about the whole of this, what happened there. So he said he thought it was one of the worst crimes committed in history. And I was asked during the trial and also later, and by journalists and by politicians and others, whether I thought he meant that sincerely. So I said, no, I am sure that this was mere lip service in order to really to save his life. So people asked me, why do you say that? I said, well, I could imagine, even a man like that could change between the end of the war, 1945, and 1961, when the trial started. I deny the possibility that his eyes could be opened, that he might be convinced by what people said or what he read and so on. Also, he is an accused person, and any doubt must go in his favor. So I said, all from that point of view, I would not deny the possibility. But here we had proof that in 1956, when he was already in the Argentine, he was visited by a Dutch fascist journalist, Willem Sassen. And the idea was that he would write about his life story, that after Eichmann's death would be published, a sort of life insurance for his family. And then when Eichmann was caught by our agents, he gave that to Life magazine, and there we got it, with the transcripts of these recordings with Eichmann's corrections in his own handwriting. No doubt about the authenticity. So Eichmann there, he knew this man came from Holland. So he said, well, you know, I was in Amsterdam, and I saw the trains with the Jews leaving from there to Auschwitz. So eine Pracht war. He said, it was marvelous to watch that. And then the Dutchman said, yes, but Mr. Eichmann, do you feel sorry sometimes for what you have done? He said, yes, I feel sorry for one thing, that I wasn't hard enough, that I wasn't tough enough, that I didn't fight these damn interventionists enough. And now you see the result, the creation of the state of Israel and the re-emergence of that race there. So I said, if he said that in 1956, 11 years after the war, and now in 61, 5 years later, when he's fighting for his life, he suddenly speaks of the gravest crime, then I think I'm justified to be, as an understatement, to be more than skeptical about that. I mean, you know, one of the most important things, of course, was this question, was he just a person who carried out orders, or was he more than that? And I can tell you, I mentioned that also in a few minutes, we showed that he countermanded Hitler's orders when he thought it might mean the saving of a few Jews here or there. I examined all the departments of the Gestapo. There were lots, everyone had his commander, but all of them, after a year or two, were changed by rotation. Only the Jewish department of the Gestapo, headed by Eichmann, he was there all during the war because his superiors realized that this man was completely obsessed with the idea that this was his personal fight and that he was the one responsible for carrying out this thing, and completely felt identical with the purpose of this terrible Holocaust. We also had proof from his friends that towards the end of the war, he said, I know the war is lost, but I'm still going to win my war. And then he went to Auschwitz to get the death rate increased from 10,000 a day to 12,000 a day. When the German army on the Eastern Front were clamoring for reinforcements and ammunition, he managed to get priority for his death trains. I mean, he must have known that that was harming Germany's war effort. Towards the end of the war, there was I don't know whether you read about that, there was someone in Germany who suggested that any German soldier who was 1/4 Jewish, one Jewish grandfather or one Jewish grandmother, that he should either be castrated or sent to a concentration camp. And Eichmann supported that wholeheartedly. The one who objected was von Keitel, the commander-in-chief of the German army, not out of humanitarian reasons, but because he said it weakens my army. There are thousands of soldiers like that. They fought together all the time until now, and we can't just now do that. And Hitler had supported Keitel in this. But I also want to tell you, you know that Hungary fought on the side of the Germans, Italy, during the war. The leader of Hungary was a man called Horthy, Admiral Horthy. And at the end of 44, beginning of 45, he thought the war was lost. So he wanted to make a separate peace with the West. Hitler tried to prevent that. So Hitler met him and by threats and promises tried to make him continue. There were 500,000 Jews still living in Hungary who had not been deported by the Hungarian authorities. Now, Horthy finally agreed, don't go into details, but he made some conditions. One condition was that the Germans should agree that 8,700 Jewish families from Budapest should be permitted to go to a neutral country. Hitler agreed, not out of humanitarian reasons, of course, but he wanted Hungary to continue on his side, and also he wanted the 500,000 Jews to deport them to the east. So he agreed to these 8,700. How do we know all that? As I told you, the Germans were very cooperative. They sent us all the documents from the German Foreign Ministry. And there was a telegram sent by the German ambassador to Budapest, von Wesenmeyer, to Ribbentrop, the minister of Foreign Affairs then. And he described the agreement between Hitler and Horthy, including the 8,700 families. But then he added, I must, however, to inform you that the local representative of the SS, Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, was very upset when he heard about the arrangement between the Führer and Horthy, because he thinks these 8,000 and so Jewish families that might be important biological material, and they might, from these neutral countries, even come to Palestine and help to recreate the race there. And therefore, Eichmann, when he heard about that, has given instructions to force now the deportation from Budapest at such a speed that until the visas can be arranged for these neutral countries, no 8,000 Jewish families will remain in Budapest. Now, I handled the whole of the Hungarian case as well in court, so I, of course, stressed this document, because really, if there's any document that can show that this man, here there was a decision of the Führer himself, so he tried even to thwart, to countermand that, just in order to see to it that no few thousand Jews should escape. I hope we have time at the end, you know, that there's one thing we fight about, you know, when there's a question of was he just an obedient servant or not. There's sometimes the books written by Hannah Arendt, you know, about it. And she, what most people don't know, not only does she have strange ideas, but that when she quoted documents, she quoted it in a completely falsified way. There's a book written by Jacob Robinson, and The Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, and he describes that. So I just want to give you this one example. She writes, for instance, about this telegram. She writes, the person who dealt with Hungary, which was actually me, he said, he put in, with great stress, a telegram sent by von Wesenmeyer to Ribbentrop, and she adds, just because the document shows that Eichmann was not prepared to obey Himmler's orders when they were contrary to the opinion of the Führer Hitler, apparently the Israeli prosecutors did not know that for Eichmann, Hitler was a semigod. It's true that for Eichmann, Hitler was a semigod, but Himmler had nothing to do with this. It's clear from the document, from the telegram sent by the German ambassador to Ribbentrop, that Hitler was the one. And of course, that made it much worse. He was the one who agreed with Horthy about the 8,000 Jewish families who could be sent to neutral countries. I mean, altogether, what really struck me is rather, I mean, I'm not prepared to say what sort of motivation there was, but when Hannah Arendt appeared in Jerusalem a few days before the trial started, I didn't know about her, so someone told me a philosopher had come from America, and she wants to write something against the trial. Seemed to be strange. Why, before the trial starts, she wants to write something against the trial? But anyway, I asked to let her know that if she had some problems, I gladly prepared to meet her, to talk about this. 2 days later, someone came to me, the same person, and said, Hannah Arendt has said she's not prepared to speak to anyone of the prosecution of the State of Israel. I mean, she doesn't have to accept everything we say, but that she was not prepared to meet anyone of the prosecution, that seemed to me as something very, 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 very strange. I mean, I give you a lot of examples about that. What really her motivation, I still don't understand. But I mean, also she said that by painting Eichmann so black, that thereby be belittled the guilt of Hitler and Himmler and Heydrich and these people. Which is, of course, nonsense. Of course, Hitler and Himmler, the ones who were the originators of the idea, of course they are more guilty than someone who was entrusted with carrying out the decision of Hitler. But the fact that Hitler and Himmler and these people kept this person there, contrary to all the other departments, and because he was completely obsessed and identified with this program, therefore that doesn't belittle their guilt, but the other way around. Anyway, many of you are jurists. First thing I, of course, examined was what possible arguments could there be for the defense and so on. Now, first of all, of course, I realized they would say Eichmann was charged under a law passed in Israel in 1950. And the State of Israel didn't exist when these offenses were committed. And therefore, this was a retroactive law. So I imagined, in fact, he did the defense, Dr. Servatius, you know, one of the defense counsels in Nuremberg, and the Israel government said we will fund any defense counsel that he's looking for. His family wanted Servatius, said Eichmann discussed it with me, and I showed him that we agreed to that, and he picked him. So defense put up this argument about retroactivity. Now, that was, in fact, easy to conquer. I mean, you don't have to be a lawyer in order to understand that ordinarily, if we do something today which is completely legal, and then in half a year's time, with retroactive effect, we make it illegal, especially if the death penalty is there, then of course it doesn't look just. But when we made that law saying that it's illegal to murder the Jews, then of course we didn't create any new norm. What was written there was illegal under the German law, and only the Nazis created a vacuum that if a person murdered is a Jew, the person who did the murder will not stand trial. And therefore, if you speak of justice, the justice demanded that a place should be found to put people on trial who made these acts. I mean, the same was argued in the Nuremberg trials. Also, that was all retroactive legislation after the war, and there was really no real basis to this argument, which was, of course, rejected. Then there was but a more serious argument was this, that they said Israel is a state of the Jewish people. The Jews were the victims of what you are referring to now in these indictment. And therefore, the justice does not only have to be done, justice also has appeared to be done. And therefore, if you have a court representing the victim, I mean the Jewish people, therefore, it doesn't look just that you put someone on trial and you punish him by people who are representing the victims of the trial. I mean, that argument was put forward also by the defense, and we imagined it would be put forward as such. Legally, again, there's no real foundation for this. The whole idea of criminal law is that if a murder is committed or a burglary, instead of the member of the family where the man was murdered, he taking his revenge in his own hand and killing someone back, or if a burglary was committed, taking revenge by himself, you have a court representing a community that was harmed and judging that man for what he done. As I said also at the time of the trial, if you find someone in Turkey who is suspected of having committed high treason against England, it's not a Turkish law that will judge, a Turkish court that will judge him, but an English court if they manage to get hold of him. And therefore, it is always, I mean, if it's, yes, some people said yes, but here there are special emotions. I said, it's quite true that there are here emotions. And I think, I mean, these are international crimes, and therefore any court all over the world is competent to judge. But I think any judge who can read evidence like that and not feel any emotions, I think he's not fit to be a judge. Of course, he has to be objective. Of course, he has to give the accused every possibility to defend himself. But the fact itself that he feels certain emotions is not really relevant. I mean, also, I don't want to take any credit for this. I did it in every case. But when I examined during the preliminary stage all these hundreds of thousands of documents, I sometimes came across documents that I thought might be of interest to the defense. And when Dr. Servatius, the defense counsel, came to Israel, I sent these documents to him. And 2 days later, he told me that he showed to Eichmann these documents, and Eichmann asked him, where did you get these documents from? He said, I got it from the attorney, from the prosecutor. So Eichmann almost fainted. He told me, he said, the fact that the Israeli prosecutor gave you documents, how is that possible, and so on. Anyway, I laughed at this, but anyway, as I say, I did this in every case, so we did it here. And the same, the judges were very, very strict with us. And they did not permit a single piece of evidence which was not really relevant to the trial itself and to Eichmann. Sometimes people who are not legalists, they say, yes, but you brought some people who were in the death camps when Eichmann was not present. Isn't that something which has nothing to do with him? That's not any person who is a prosecutor and who knows about pre-criminal cases. Of course, when we charge Eichmann as being an accomplice to the murder of all these people, then we have to show, of course, what he did and how he planned it and how he arranged for it and how he got the gas and how he sent it to the death camps. But we have to show that people were in fact killed. So the fact that people were killed in these death camps and how it was done and how many it was done, that is something we have to prove. Therefore, all this was part of the relevant evidence. But about this question of the victim, I also want to something I cannot forget. There was one day a professor from one of the European countries, from a university, came to me And he said also, the Israel, the victim, and so on, is it just? So before I could answer, he said, can you show me the indictment? So I showed him the indictment of Eichmann. And there he saw that in addition to the persecution of Jews, we had accused Eichmann, through his department, of killing gypsies, killing Russian commissars, killing some Czech and Polish people. So he looked at it and he said, tell me, why did you charge him with that? Why didn't you leave that to a Czech court or a Polish court or a Russian court? So I said, wait a minute, 5 minutes ago, you said that you thought that a country representing victims should not be able to judge someone. But you don't seem to have any problem with a Czech court, a Russian court, a Polish court. But when it comes to a court of a Jewish state, you suddenly have that problem. But the man had the decency to blush. And he said, I really don't know why I made that distinction. I must think about it, I'll call you. I never heard from him again. But you see, I mean, this was typical. And I must tell you, in that connection also, I'll never forget the first moment of that trial. When these judges came into the courtroom with the Israeli emblem behind them, and that man whose only object in life had been to destroy that people, when he stood up to attention before an Israeli court, of a sovereign Israeli court, of a sovereign Israeli nation, I must tell you the importance and the purpose and as I say, the real essence of the creation of the State of Israel suddenly became clearer to me than at any moment that had preceded that. Just when I speak of moments, sometimes people ask me, sort of, are there some moments where you had some difficulty to control yourself? Now, we haven't got the time now to go into any of these things, but I just want to tell you, for instance, there was one witness, the only witness, and I think the only person who lives, who was already in the gas chamber with the doors closed, and who could tell what happened. How come? He was a child, and he described how he, together with 200 other children, were pushed into the gas chambers. And he described how the doors were closed and how it was dark, and the children began to sing to give themselves courage. And then, when at first nothing happened, for a few minutes, they began to cry and to shout. And then the door opened. Why? We had other evidence about that as well. A train had arrived at that moment in Auschwitz with a load of potatoes, and there were not enough SS men to unload it. So the SS commander had the glorious idea, why not use some of the children before they are killed to help unload the train? So they opened the door and they took out the 20 children next to the door. He was one of those. Then they closed the door. The other 180 were killed right away. And these other 20 had to help, and they were also killed. But the commander had said that he'd done some negligence and that he had done some damage to one of the trucks. So the commander held that before he would be killed with the next group after that, he should be beaten by a policeman and in the camp, and he should be flogged. And the SS men who had to carry out the flogging took a liking to him and kept him as his hostage, as his bedman, until the end of the war. This is how he managed to escape there. He also described, he and some other witnesses who were with these children described how he got into the death camp in the gas chamber on that day. The children who could still work were used for that. But the ones after 3 or 4 days were killed, but they were used for a few days. But you had to be of a certain height. So they didn't want to examine every child. So they put up a sort of two vertical sticks and a horizontal one, and the children had to walk underneath that. And any child that didn't come up to a certain height was sent to the gas chamber right away. Now, he was very little and very weak. And he and his elder brother realized that he wouldn't make it. So the brother took some stones and put it in the shoes of his little brother, that he should be a bit higher. And he kept him up, so that it should help. But the SS man who was in charge saw that. I think he killed the brother right away, or he sent the brother away, and he was sent to the gas chamber right away. Anyway, I just want to tell you, I mean, there were lots of cruel things in this trial, but after that witness, the judges were also a bit dazed, and they said, all right, we just have to make a little break of 15 minutes. And I went into my chambers, and suddenly the door burst open, and the young defense counsel of Eichmann burst into my room and burst out into hysterical weeping. And I had to protect, I had to really to treat him, to prepare coffee for him to enable him to continue. I mean, there are certain moments, or like Jaselewska, I'm sure you've heard of her, the woman who had to, who all the members of her family were killed in front of her, and she was hit. The blood was coming up. I mean, there are moments like this that are difficult to understand, difficult to grasp. And but sometimes people ask me, tell me, wasn't there a moment when you yourself could hardly continue questioning a witness in court? Well, I just want to share that with you. I told you about Hungary, and I told you that there, usually Eichmann sat in Berlin, pulled the strings. But when the German army entered Hungary, after this arrangement with Hitler, Eichmann was sent by Himmler personally to see to it that no Jews should escape, should be no mass escape from people from Hungary. So Eichmann, it's interesting, he was there as waiting for his trial and is afraid for what happened, but he was still proud of everything he did. So he said the first thing he did, and we had other evidence about that as well, was that he gave orders that the first Jews from Hungary who got to Auschwitz, before they were put into the gas chambers, they were forced to write postcards to their friends and their families. Eichmann dictated what had to be there. We are here in a beautiful country resort called Waldsee. Lovely excursions in the neighborhood, only very light work, but not a lot of room. So please come as quickly as possible in order to get the villas and the barracks that are still available. So Eichmann added, he told us, we didn't know that, he said, I even added, bring good shoes with you for the excursions so that the army could get the shoes when these people are sent into the gas chamber. Now, when I handled the Hungarian evidence, I had there more witnesses than for any other country, because there Eichmann was in person. Usually he was in Berlin and pulled the strings, but there he was in person. So there were quite a number. We took about 4 or 5 days to hear all those witnesses. And one day before the end, I heard there was a man in Israel who has such a postcard and was still alive. So I managed to get hold of him. I said, come to Jerusalem immediately. He came at 11 o'clock at night. I tell this because usually I questioned all the witnesses very carefully before I called them. But here, and I had never more than 3 hours sleep during the trial. So when this man came, and at 11 o'clock at night, I just asked him to show me the postcard, translate it to me from Hungarian to Hebrew, which he did. And then I said, look, what happened to your family, you tell me tomorrow morning when I call you as a witness. So I heard the story for the first time. I asked him about the postcard, and of course he told that. Then I said, what happened to your family? He said, well, we came there with some hundreds of others. We had no idea what Auschwitz, Birkenau, what it meant. And then I said, I and my wife and my little daughter, she was only 2.5 years old, and my son was 13 years old, we were standing there. He described the selection. The woman to the left, the little girl to the left. And then he was asked, what was your position? I said, I was an engineer in the army, all right, to the right. What about your son? How old is he? 13. So the SS man said, well, I have to examine this with my colleague, with my commander. So it took a minute or two, and then he came and he said, all right, run after your mother. And the witness, you could see that he was back there, and he said, I looked at all those people who had been to the left. I said, I thought, will my son find my wife? Because there were already hundreds of others in between. I looked, I couldn't see my wife anymore. She was swallowed up in the crowd. I couldn't see my son anymore. He was swallowed up. But my little daughter, she had a little red coat, and that little red dot getting smaller and smaller. This is how my family disappeared from my life. Now, my daughter Orly, she was exactly 2.5 years old during that moment, and I had bought her a little red coat 2 weeks before that. And the day before that witness spoke, my wife had taken a picture of her and of me, her with a red coat. So when the witness said that, about that little red dot getting smaller and smaller, this is how his family disappeared, and I heard it for the first time, it sort of cut off my throat completely. I suddenly couldn't utter a sound. And the witness recovered, waited for the next question. The judges gave me a sign to continue, and the television was on me. It took 3 or 4 minutes or so until I started playing with my documents, until I managed to get together again. And I can tell you, and I've told others, that since then I can be in a football stadium, or I can be in a restaurant, or I can be in the street outside, and suddenly my heart starts beating, and I turn around and I see a little girl or a little boy in a red coat. I mean, that's maybe a banal little story, but for me, somehow that represents the trial more than any other thing. I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Just want to speak also about the results of that case. Some of the main ones. First of all, for instance, it was something interesting. Our young people in Israel, teachers and school masters told me before the trial that most of our young people did not want to hear about the Holocaust. Why? Young Israelis felt ashamed in a way. They said a young Israeli can understand that you can be hurt fighting, that you can be killed fighting, that you can lose a battle. He can understand that. But he cannot understand how hundreds of thousands or millions of people can be taken away, slaughtered without real resistance. And therefore, they didn't want to hear about that. Now, that was not the main purpose of the prosecution, but we wanted also to show our young people that there was no reason for this feeling of shame. So as I told you about these postcards that Eichmann, we showed in court how in a systematic, scientific way almost, people, whether they were Jews or whether they were gypsies or Russian commissars or others, where they were misled up to the last minute and then weakened to such an extent that they couldn't resist. And then, like in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the Warsaw Ghetto, when Jews knew that death was waiting for them, how they fought and were killed up to the last man in the most courageous way. So there was no reason to be ashamed. On the contrary, I could be proud. And then the same in Germany, maybe a different way. Teachers in Germany told me there were always teachers who wanted to show the people in what happened, the children. There were always prosecutors who wanted to charge, mainly the ones in the death camps. But they were never given budgets for that. The teachers told me the parents who were Nazis, they certainly didn't want the children to know about that, to hear about that. But even the ones who were not Nazis, they did not want the children to come home and ask, where were you? Why didn't you do something about it? Why didn't you protest? What did you do against it? So they preferred not to. But then came the Eichmann trial, and it came into all the homes for every evening for an hour, so they couldn't stand anymore before these teachers who wanted to bring it to court, and there started a chain reaction of trials, should have maybe before, but anyway started afterwards. All the big cases about Auschwitz and Majdanek and Treblinka and Sobibor in Belgium. I mean, all these things, all these big death camps where cases started, they were heard after the Eichmann trial, and as a result, and with the German meticulousness, we have now documents, German documents, in all meticulous details of what happened in these places. And that is of particular importance, not only from the point of view of justice, but also of importance to counter all these deniers who nowadays say that this is an exaggeration and all these things didn't happen. It's a Zionist the invention or things like that, or at any rate didn't happen, wasn't so serious. Therefore, the fact that we have now German documents to show that is of great importance. And I also, I mean, I'm regarded sometimes as an incurable optimist. But anyway, I must say, when I'm invited now, they've decided in every German province where they have a parliament to devote a whole day every year about the Holocaust, and many of them invite me to come there. And not only that, they ask me every time when I come to also meet with young people, with pupils. I was in Saarbrücken last year, and they said they brought me with 400 children, and the children were asked to prepare themselves and to read, but to hear then some of the real stories of what my memory as a child in Germany and afterwards during the Eichmann trial and etc. And they want to know, in order that the children should know all the details, in order that things like that should never happen again. Now, of course, everybody hears anti-Semitism here, anti-Semitism there, but the fact that this tendency exists. And that, I mean, last year, just 2 months ago, I was invited to by the leader of the European Parliament in Brussels to speak about that. I was invited by the former Prime Minister of Austria to come to Vienna and to with him together to speak to all people, judges, and the fact that all over the world this interest exists with the intention that young people should know that things like that are completely forbidden and should never, are frightening and should never happen again. That is something which gives me some hope for the future. Thank you very much for your question.